In this case, resistance did not emerge from institutional failure. It followed a period in which internal performance advanced beyond what the system had previously been required to absorb. The events unfolded inside a mature organization operating under long-term stability. Performance metrics were calibrated for continuity rather than adaptation. This was not a period defined by crisis, reform, or rapid expansion. It was a late-stage phase of consolidation, when procedures had already been standardized across departments and success was measured primarily by repeatability. Within such environments, variation is managed quietly. Deviations are not prohibited outright, but absorbed, normalized, or reduced through process. Over time, the institution learns how to preserve equilibrium by limiting the range of outcomes it must accommodate. Nothing in the surrounding conditions suggested imminent change. Authority structures were intact. Reporting lines remained stable. Oversight mechanisms functioned as designed. The system did not appear strained. Within that environment, a single operational choice elevated performance beyond prior precedent and revealed limits the institution had never needed to confront. The decision did not arrive as a declaration or a shift in mission. It emerged incrementally through a series of internal approvals that treated elevated output as confirmation rather than deviation. Existing controls remained in place. Reporting structures were unchanged. No new authority was created. What shifted was tolerance. Performance that might previously have been moderated was allowed to persist because it produced measurable gains without immediate disruption. No individual framed the adjustment as exceptional. It was described as alignment. Capacity appeared underutilized. The change seemed corrective rather than ambitious. Short-term indicators responded favorably, reinforcing the assumption that the system was functioning as intended. The decision required no defense. It was not debated or celebrated. It passed quietly through the institution, absorbed as evidence that existing structures could stretch further than previously assumed. At the time, there was little reason to resist it. The organization had been built to reward consistency, and the results appeared consistent with its stated aims. The decision did not challenge authority. It appeared to validate it. Locally, the outcome registered as success. Output increased, timelines compressed, comparative benchmarks shifted in favor of the unit responsible. In isolation, the results justified continuation. Structurally, however, effects accumulated outside the frame of formal measurement. Processes downstream began to deform to accommodate the new performance ceiling. Dependencies tightened. Margins for delay, error, and variance narrowed without being renegotiated. What had once functioned as optional capacity was reclassified informally as baseline expectation. The institution did not record this as change. It recorded continuity. But the conditions that allowed the performance to exist were no longer evenly distributed. Other units adapted defensively, some by accelerating unsustainably, others by narrowing scope to preserve reliability. Coordination costs rose without attribution. Resilience became conditional. Over time, the elevated performance stopped functioning as an exception and began functioning as a reference point. Planning assumptions recalibrated around it. When the original conditions softened, through personnel turnover, scale expansion, or external pressure, the system lacked a mechanism to step back down. In this case, the consequence was not collapse. It manifested instead as brittleness. The institution remained operational, but its tolerance for deviation declined. Authority centralized subtly around the performance standard, and resistance began to emerge, not against the decision itself, but against the instability it introduced into a system designed for steadiness. At this stage, the decision no longer functioned as an improvement. It functioned as an environmental shift. Its success was no longer transferable across the institution because the conditions that sustained it were uneven, time-bound, and unacknowledged. What had appeared as elevated performance now operated as a silent constraint on everything around it. The institution did not respond by reversing course. Instead, it normalized strain. Planning cycles adjusted. Expectations hardened. Variance was reframed as underperformance rather than contextual mismatch. The original decision retained its status as a success, even as the system's capacity to absorb deviation diminished. Resistance did not take the form of opposition. It surfaced through structure, procedural friction, slowed approvals, informal containment. Excellence was no longer evaluated on merit alone, but on compatibility. The decision had not failed. Its context had expired. When later attempts were made to reproduce the outcome, they failed without obvious error. The same metrics were applied. The same benchmarks were cited. In some cases, the same personnel were involved. What had changed was not intent or competence, but the surrounding conditions. Scale was the first fracture point. What functioned within a bounded unit could not survive replication across interdependent systems. Coordination overhead increased. Latent dependencies surfaced. Timelines that had once compressed now collided. The performance standard, when transferred, behaved less like a capability and more like a stress condition the institution had never prepared to sustain continuously. Incentives inverted quietly. Units tasked with maintaining reliability were now measured against a benchmark produced under exceptional alignment. Compliance replaced judgment. Risk tolerance narrowed. As conditions continued to shift, through market saturation, regulatory drag, or leadership turnover, the original decision lost its interpretive shelter. What had once been contextual excellence was reclassified as deviation. The failure was not in imitation itself, but in the assumption that performance could be separated from the environment that made it legible. What could not be transferred was not skill, but tolerance. In retrospect, the resistance appears earlier than it was recognized, not as opposition, but as calibration. Small delays, additional sign-offs, language shifts in internal reviews that reframe deviation as risk rather than contribution. Each adjustment was defensible in isolation. Only with distance does the pattern compress. The institution did not resist excellence directly. It resisted the loss of predictability that excellence introduced once it exceeded the system's design variance. What appeared as obstruction functioned as self-preservation enacted through process. The performance standard remained cited long after it stopped functioning. It persisted as reference, not as reality. And in that persistence, it quietly redefined failure, less as breakdown, more as nonconformity to a past condition that no longer existed. The institution did not reverse the decision. It could not without acknowledging that its own structures had been reshaped by a moment it no longer fully understood. Instead, it absorbed the outcome selectively, retaining the standard while constraining the conditions that had produced it. Excellence remained intact as an artifact, but isolated from repetition. Resistance hardened into policy. Over time, the system stabilized again, at a lower tolerance for deviation and with fewer pathways for performance to exceed design. Nothing collapsed. Nothing was corrected. The cost remained embedded, a structure that learned how to defend itself against outcomes it could not safely reproduce. It ends there, not on failure, but on a system that survived by narrowing what it would allow to work.